Fentanyl pills, the largest seizure in our nation's history. These are the pills recovered during the operation. During Miami's sweltering summer months, the DEA executed a sophisticated financial operation, utilizing blockchain technology to trace the Sinaloa cartel's digital transactions and disrupt their financial infrastructure. However, they were unaware that their primary target was observing from concealment, and his subsequent clandestine maneuver would alter everything. The operation proceeded like a textbook demonstration of modern law enforcement, where conventional investigative methods combined with advanced blockchain analytics to penetrate what numerous criminals had mistakenly considered an impregnable shield of secrecy. The confiscated cryptocurrency was directly connected to the Sinaloa cartel's Miami, Florida operations, representing more than just financial assets, but a critical pipeline that had been funding devastation and mortality throughout American neighborhoods. To remove this enormous quantity of drugs and weapons from our streets, approximately $5 million in currency, 35 kilograms of methamphetamine, 35 kilos of meth, 7.5 kilograms of cocaine, 4.5 kilograms of heroin, 49 rifles and handguns, all displayed in the photographs. Envision, if you would, the instant when federal operatives comprehended the scale of what they had discovered. In austere government facilities, computer monitors illuminated with transaction documentation that revealed a narrative of international criminality on an almost unimaginable magnitude. Each Bitcoin transaction, each Ethereum exchange, each digital currency movement had been carefully monitored using sophisticated blockchain analytics that conquered the obstacles of perceived invisibility, proving that even in the digital era, criminals cannot evade the extensive reach of justice. Yet this Miami cryptocurrency confiscation was simply one remarkable component of a significantly larger, more comprehensive initiative. The operation formed part of Operation Take Back America, a multi-agency powerhouse under the U.S. Department of Justice that had been methodically destroying cartel operations nationwide. Since January 2025, this synchronized effort has accomplished results that would have appeared unattainable merely one decade earlier. The seizure of 44 million fentanyl pills, 4,500 pounds of fentanyl powder, nearly 65,000 pounds of methamphetamine, and over 21,500 pounds of cocaine. The figures are astounding, yet beneath each statistic exists a human narrative. Those 44 million fentanyl pills signify 44 million potential overdoses averted. 44 million families protected from the heartbreaking phone call that their beloved one had fallen victim to synthetic opioids. The nearly 250,000 pounds of cocaine confiscated signifies entire neighborhoods safeguarded from the violence and dependency that unavoidably accompanies cocaine's presence. DEA Acting Administrator Robert Murphy, a veteran law enforcement professional who had witnessed the transformation of drug trafficking from street-level operations to complex international networks, captured the spirit of this innovative approach with words that echoed throughout the law enforcement brotherhood. "We've seized approximately 70,000 pounds of methamphetamine." Now, to put that in context, in 2024, that's the entire amount that we seized for DEA, 70,000 pounds. And that was a record year for DEA, and at this pace, at a minimum, we're going to double what we seized last year. His declaration wasn't simply words. It represented a fundamental transformation in strategy, from reactive policing to proactive financial combat. While federal operatives in Miami were commemorating their cryptocurrency triumph against the Sinaloa cartel, another narrative was concurrently developing in the tropical haven of the Florida Keys. A narrative that would reveal the shocking degree to which drug trafficking operations had penetrated the very institutions designed to protect American neighborhoods. This wasn't a chronicle of foreign cartels functioning from mysterious safe houses. This was the troubling disclosure that corruption and criminal conspiracy had established roots within the trusted positions of public employees, boat operators, and community members who had betrayed their neighbors' confidence for illicit profits. In September 2024, a separate but equally substantial operation in Miami, Dade and the Florida Keys resulted in accusations against 27 suspects. However, the makeup of this criminal organization would astonish even experienced law enforcement professionals. Among those accused were employees of the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, the very individuals entrusted with sustaining the water supply that maintains communities healthy and secure. Commercial charter boat operators, whose vessels should have been transporting tourists on picturesque fishing adventures, had instead been converted into cocaine transportation platforms. Even a former City of Marathon employee had abandoned their commitment to serve the public in exchange for serving the insatiable demand of America's drug marketplace. The magnitude of this treachery becomes even more alarming when you examine the techniques these criminals utilized. Some cocaine was discovered concealed in local waters and mangroves, transforming Florida's pristine natural landscapes into storage locations for poison. The crystal-clear waters that draw millions of tourists yearly, the mangrove ecosystems that function as nurseries for innumerable marine species, had been violated by criminals who perceived nature itself as nothing beyond a convenient concealment place for their lethal merchandise. However, the genuine horror of this operation becomes evident when you follow the distribution system these criminals had constructed. The cocaine wasn't remaining in the relatively secluded Florida Keys, or even in the affluent communities of Miami-Dade County. Instead, it was being circulated in locations like Florida City and Homestead, including near playgrounds, the sacred areas where children should feel protected to play, learn, and develop without exposure to the devastating impact of illegal drugs. They are flooding our cities with a weapon of mass destruction, fentanyl. And when we catch you, like all of these individuals, if convicted, we will put you behind bars. There will be no negotiating, and we will lock you up for as long as humanly possible. Consider for a moment the profound violation this constitutes. Parents delivering their children to these playgrounds, believing that they were supplying their kids with a secure environment for recreation and social interaction, had no awareness that drug dealers were executing business in the shadows adjacent. Teachers and community leaders laboring tirelessly to establish positive influences in these neighborhoods were unknowingly competing against criminals who were inundating their communities with substances engineered to demolish lives and futures. The suspects confronted charges for conspiring to distribute varying quantities of cocaine, ranging from less than 500 grams to 5 kilograms or more, indicating a sophisticated distribution system with multiple operational tiers. This wasn't a straightforward buy and sell arrangement. This was a complex criminal enterprise with different responsibility levels, different risk assessments, and different profit structures. Essentially, a legitimate business framework applied to illegitimate objectives. The investigation that produced these arrests was a masterwork of modern law enforcement methodology, combining traditional techniques with cutting-edge technology. The operation, which commenced in 2020, involved wiretaps, electronic surveillance, and human intelligence, with the FBI, Homestead Police, and Miami-Dade Police all contributing their knowledge. For 4 years, federal and local operatives meticulously constructed their case, collecting evidence, identifying conspirators, and charting the intricate network of relationships that made this criminal organization possible. At the center of this criminal network stood John Robert Strama Jr., alleged to be the head of the conspiracy, who confronted additional charges for cocaine distribution, employing a minor under 14 in trafficking activities, and possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. The involvement of a child under 14 in drug trafficking activities represents perhaps the most disturbing element of this entire operation. This wasn't simply about adults making poor decisions that would impact their own lives. This was about criminals so callous, so utterly lacking moral constraints, that they were prepared to corrupt and endanger children to advance their illegal enterprise. The utilization of minors in drug trafficking operations represents one of the most insidious elements of modern criminal enterprises. Children, often from disadvantaged circumstances or broken families, are recruited because they face lighter consequences if apprehended, because they're less likely to be suspected by law enforcement, and because they're more easily manipulated and dominated. The psychological destruction inflicted on these children, compelled to participate in criminal activities during the most formative periods of their lives, creates victims whose trauma may persist far longer than any prison sentence imposed on their adult manipulators. The success of Operation Take Back America had resulted in more than 2,100 fentanyl-related arrests. Yet the cryptocurrency seizure in Miami represented something different, a direct assault at the financial core of cartel operations. While apprehending street-level dealers and mid-level distributors certainly disrupts operations, seizing the money that finances those operations strikes at the very foundation of criminal enterprises. The Miami operations against the Sinaloa cartel weren't isolated triumphs in an otherwise losing conflict. They were components of a relentless campaign of massive drug busts that had been systematically dismantling criminal empires for decades. Each operation conveyed a narrative of law enforcement adaptation, criminal innovation, and the endless struggle between those who profit from human misery and those sworn to protect society from their predations. These 10 monumental seizures reveal the true scope of the cartel threat and the extraordinary efforts required to combat organizations whose wealth and power rival nation-states. The sheer boldness of cartel operations becomes apparent when you examine the quantities involved in these historic busts. In June 2019, the Port of Philadelphia became the epicenter of what would become one of the largest cocaine seizures in American history. U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents conducting what they anticipated would be a routine inspection of a container ship arriving from South America instead uncovered a staggering treasure trove of death. Approximately 39,525 pounds, nearly 20 tons of pure cocaine, with an estimated street value of $1.3 billion. To place this in perspective, this single shipment contained enough cocaine to supply the entire East Coast drug market for months, representing millions of potential addictions, thousands of potential overdoses, and countless families that would have been destroyed by the poison hidden in those innocent-looking shipping containers. However, the Philadelphia bust pales in comparison to the industrial-scale operations that the U.S. Coast Guard has been intercepting in international waters. In December 2016, Coast Guard cutters Hamilton and Mellon, working alongside Canadian partners, conducted a series of 27 interdictions and bail recoveries in the Eastern Pacific that resulted in the seizure of approximately 53,000 pounds, over 26 tons of cocaine, with a wholesale value of $715 million. This multi-month operation in the drug transit zones demonstrated the maritime highways that cartels had established, turning the vast Pacific Ocean into their personal shipping lanes for poison destined for American communities. The global reach of cartel operations became even more apparent with Ecuador's massive November 2016 seizure of over 81 metric tons of cocaine, a bust so enormous that it required international coordination and support to process and secure. This wasn't simply a matter of intercepting a single shipment. This represented the discovery of a major distribution hub that was feeding drug markets across multiple continents, with export routes carefully planned to reach consumers in both the United States and Europe. The sophistication of modern cartel operations reached new heights with Operation Crystal Shield in October 2020, a DEA-led initiative that perfectly demonstrated how criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple drug trafficking into complex multi-product enterprises. This single operation resulted in the seizure of 2,224 pounds of methamphetamine, 893 pounds of cocaine, and 13 pounds of heroin across multiple U.S. cities, including Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Houston. However, the true significance of Crystal Shield wasn't just the drugs seized, it was the 1,840 arrests made and the $43.3 million in cash that was taken directly from Sinaloa cartel operations, demonstrating how law enforcement had learned to attack both the product and the profit simultaneously. The evolution of cartel maritime operations was further exposed in March 2025 when Coast Guard cutters Stone and Mohawk intercepted approximately 45,600 pounds of illicit narcotics, worth over $517.50 million in international waters off the Eastern Pacific. The sophistication of the smuggling operation was remarkable. Criminals were utilizing ghost vessels, fishing boats, and sailing vessels, creating a diverse fleet that could adapt to different weather conditions, law enforcement patterns, and operational requirements. Evidence linked these seizures directly to both the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, both designated as foreign terrorist organizations, revealing how these criminal empires had learned to cooperate and coordinate their operations across traditional territorial boundaries. Historical perspective reveals that massive drug busts have been a constant feature of the war against cartels for over 4 decades. The 1991 Long Island cocaine bust remains a textbook example of how traditional investigative techniques could uncover industrial-scale criminal operations. DEA agents and local law enforcement, following leads and conducting patient surveillance, raided a warehouse where they discovered 10,771 pounds of cocaine, around 5 tons, worth approximately $861 million. The sophistication of the operation was remarkable, with hidden compartments in vehicles and carefully orchestrated distribution networks that connected the Cali cartel in Mexico with organized crime families in New York. Border interdiction operations have consistently revealed the volume of drugs that cartels attempt to smuggle into the United States on a daily basis. The October 2020 bust at Otay Mesa Port of Entry in California stands as the second-largest methamphetamine seizure ever recorded at a U.S. border crossing. CBP officers conducting what appeared to be a routine inspection of a tractor-trailer instead discovered 3,014 pounds of methamphetamine, 64 pounds of heroin, and 29 pounds of fentanyl powder hidden in specially constructed compartments. This single vehicle carried enough drugs to devastate entire communities, enough fentanyl to kill thousands of Americans, and enough methamphetamine to fuel addiction crises across multiple states. International cooperation has been crucial in achieving the kind of results that can truly damage cartel operations. The 1984 raid on Tranquilandia in Colombia represents one of the most significant victories in the history of drug enforcement. This joint U.S.-Colombian operation destroyed a massive processing complex operated by Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel, seizing 10 tons of cocaine worth around $1.2 billion, and demonstrating that even the most remote and heavily defended cartel installations could be reached by determined law enforcement efforts. Maritime interdiction operations have consistently proven that the oceans provide no sanctuary for criminal enterprises. The 1995 Peruvian offshore cocaine interception, where U.S. and Peruvian forces worked together to seize over 12 tons of cocaine from a vessel operating in international waters, demonstrated the global reach required to combat organizations that view national boundaries as mere inconveniences to be overcome through superior logistics and firepower. The modern era of cartel enforcement was perfectly exemplified by the February 2024 FBI multi-state takedown that arrested nearly 200 people while seizing 1,860 pounds of methamphetamine, 292 pounds of cocaine, 44 pounds of fentanyl, and 9 pounds of heroin, with an estimated wholesale value between $16 minus $28 million. This operation targeted Mexican cartels, including Sinaloa affiliates operating across North America, demonstrating how criminal organizations had successfully established distribution networks that spanned the entire continent. However, perhaps the most significant aspect of these massive busts isn't the quantities seized or the money confiscated, it's what they reveal about the evolution of both criminal organizations and law enforcement response. Each operation represents years of investigation, international cooperation, and technological innovation. The Philadelphia port bust required sophisticated intelligence about shipping patterns and container inspections. The Coast Guard interdictions demanded unprecedented coordination between multiple vessels, aircraft, and intelligence agencies. The multi-state FBI operation relied on wiretaps, surveillance, and human intelligence networks that took years to develop and deploy. The message from these 10 massive operations is clear. No criminal empire is invincible, no smuggling operation is undetectable, and no amount of money or corruption can provide permanent protection from the consequences of poisoning communities and destroying lives. Each bust represents not just drugs and money removed from criminal circulation, but families protected, communities preserved, and a demonstration that justice, while sometimes slow, is ultimately inexorable in its pursuit of those who profit from human suffering. In the mountainous strongholds of Sinaloa State, where cartel leaders once operated with impunity and government authority existed only at their sufferance, a fundamental transformation has been taking place. The Mexican government, under President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration, has embarked on what can only be described as a comprehensive campaign to reclaim national sovereignty from criminal organizations that had grown so powerful they effectively functioned as shadow governments. This isn't simply law enforcement activity. This is a battle for the very soul of Mexico. A struggle to determine whether legitimate democratic institutions or criminal cartels will ultimately control the destiny of 128 million Mexican citizens. The scope of Mexico's challenge becomes immediately apparent when you consider the violent statistics that have defined 2025. Homicides in Sinaloa State rose 400% following key arrests in 2024, including that of Ismael El Mayo Zambada as different cartel factions, Los Chapitos versus Zambada loyalists, engaged in open warfare for control of smuggling routes, drug production facilities, and political influence. This wasn't gang violence in the traditional sense. This was armed conflict between well-equipped military-style organizations fighting for territorial control with sophisticated weapons, intelligence networks, and financial resources that rival those of national armies. The Mexican government's response has been unprecedented in both scale and sophistication. In August 2025, the Mexican Army and National Guard conducted a massive raid in Culiacan, Sinaloa, the cartel's traditional stronghold, seizing 300 kilograms, 661 pounds, of crystal methamphetamine, 96 tons of chemical precursors, 270,000 liters of additional chemicals, and industrial equipment from 8 warehouses. Based on research documents, this operation, described as the largest seizure under the current administration, disrupted fentanyl and methamphetamine production on an industrial scale, demonstrating that the Mexican government was finally willing to strike directly at the economic infrastructure that makes cartel operations possible. However, individual raids, however successful, represent only one component of a much larger strategy. The deployment of additional troops and National Guard units to Sinaloa and other cartel hotspots reflects a fundamental shift in Mexican government policy. For years, critics had argued that certain Mexican administrations had adopted a policy of accommodation with cartels, allowing them to operate with minimal interference as long as they kept violence to manageable levels. The Sheinbaum administration has clearly rejected this approach, instead choosing direct confrontation despite the obvious risks to public safety and political stability. The international dimension of Mexico's anti-cartel campaign has created both opportunities and tensions in the relationship with the United States. Mexico has facilitated the handover of dozens of alleged Sinaloa figures to the U.S. in 2025, responding to bounties and the U.S. designation of the cartel as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025. These extraditions represent a significant shift in Mexican policy, demonstrating a willingness to allow American prosecution of criminals who might previously have been processed exclusively through Mexican courts. However, this cooperation has been complicated by tensions over sovereignty and methodology. President Sheinbaum has been explicit in rejecting U.S. military intervention while emphasizing joint efforts, reflecting Mexico's delicate balance between accepting American assistance and maintaining national independence. The Mexican government recognizes that cartel operations transcend national boundaries and require international cooperation, but they're equally determined to ensure that solutions respect Mexican sovereignty and constitutional principles. Project Potrero, launched by the DEA in August 2025, represents the kind of bilateral cooperation that both governments see as essential for success. This initiative focuses on dismantling cartel gatekeepers who control smuggling corridors along the U.S.-Mexico border through a multi-week training program that brings Mexican investigators together with U.S. law enforcement, prosecutors, defense officials, and intelligence community members. The program represents a recognition that effective anti-cartel operations require not just shared intelligence, but shared expertise, methodology, and strategic thinking. However, even successful cooperation programs have revealed the complexities of bilateral anti-cartel efforts. When President Sheinbaum publicly denied knowledge of a major new initiative with the DEA regarding Project Potrero, it highlighted the coordination challenges that continue to complicate U.S.-Mexico relations. These coordination gaps aren't necessarily evidence of bad faith on either side. They reflect the complexity of managing relationships between different agencies, different levels of government, and different political systems with distinct priorities and constraints. The challenge of corruption continues to complicate Mexico's anti-cartel efforts, despite the government's increased commitment to confronting criminal organizations. Historical analysis reveals that cartels like Sinaloa have systematically infiltrated Mexican institutions, from local police departments to high-level federal positions, creating networks of corruption that can undermine even the most well-intentioned law enforcement operations. The 2019 U.S. trial of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán revealed testimony suggesting that former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto had received a $100 million bribe from the cartel, illustrating how corruption had reached the highest levels of government. Addressing this corruption requires more than simply replacing corrupt officials. It demands systematic institutional reform, enhanced oversight mechanisms, and cultural changes that make corruption both more difficult to accomplish and more dangerous to attempt. The Sheinbaum administration has emphasized these institutional reforms, but changing deeply embedded patterns of corruption requires sustained effort over many years, not just political declarations and high-profile arrests. The economic dimension of Mexico's anti-cartel campaign reveals the complexity of the challenge facing the government. Cartels don't simply engage in drug trafficking. They've diversified into extortion, kidnapping, resource theft, and what amounts to taxation of legitimate businesses operating in territories they control. In some regions, cartels provide basic services that government institutions have failed to deliver, creating a form of shadow governance that complicates efforts to establish legitimate state authority. This economic integration means that eliminating cartel influence requires more than law enforcement activity. It demands economic development, infrastructure investment, and social programs that provide legitimate alternatives to criminal employment. Young people who might otherwise be recruited by cartels need educational opportunities, job training, and economic prospects that can compete with the immediate financial rewards that criminal organizations offer. The international implications of Mexico's anti-cartel campaign extend far beyond bilateral U.S.-Mexico relations. In May 2025, a European drug ring tied to Sinaloa was dismantled, revealing global corruption links that demonstrated how Mexican cartels had established operations across multiple continents. These international networks require coordinated responses from law enforcement agencies around the world, creating diplomatic and operational challenges that no single nation can address independently. Recent joint operations have achieved significant tactical successes while highlighting the battle for Mexico's soul and America's security continues. However, the victories in Miami, the massive busts across two nations, and the unprecedented cooperation between sovereign governments demonstrate that this is a war that can be won if both nations maintain the courage, commitment, and cooperation necessary to see it through to ultimate victory. The cartel empire that once seemed invincible has been proven vulnerable, and justice has shown that it possesses both the tools and the determination necessary to prevail in this defining struggle of our time. Thanks for watching. Check out other content on the channel.